The Hamptons learned how to hold their breath that afternoon. White linen billowed between tall pines, catching the late summer light like sails frozen mid-journey. Rows of chairs faced the Atlantic, their pale wood glowing honey gold under a sun that had learned restraint. At the very front sat a single empty seat, draped with a soft gray shawl, a small framed photograph resting on it. The memorial chair. An American wedding tradition meant to honor those who could not attend in body, only in memory. Karen had insisted on it. She stood just beyond the arbor, her back straight, shoulders squared in silk and lace. The dress fit her like resolve, clean lines, no excess. Her makeup was minimal, her face luminous not from shimmer but from stillness. When she smiled at passing guests, it reached her eyes, but only briefly, like a tide testing the shore. Behind her, somewhere past the catered laughter and clinking crystal, the bridal suite hummed with movement. Assistants whispered, doors opened and closed, a violinist adjusted his bow. Karen turned to retrieve her bouquet. That was when she heard her name, soft, careless, unguarded. "After today," Nicholas murmured, his voice low but sharpened by certainty, "their family fortune will finally pay for your legs and my father's life." Silence followed, not the kind that echoes, but the kind that seals. Karen didn't move. She stood there, fingers still curled around air, as if the bouquet were already gone. Her breath slowed, deliberate. The words didn't land like a blow. They arrived like a diagnosis, clinical, irreversible. She shifted slightly, just enough to see into the room through the half-open door. Nicholas stood with his back to her, tailored tuxedo, familiar shoulders. The man she had loved for 3 years, trusted with her future, was bent slightly toward his mother who sat in a wheelchair by the window. Her hands were folded in her lap, knuckles pale. She nodded once, slowly, as if accepting a contract. Karen watched Nicholas's jaw tighten, not with grief, but with anticipation. The light in the room was harsh, too bright, unforgiving. She stepped back before anyone could turn. Outside, the ocean breathed. Guests laughed. The officiant checked his watch. Karen walked, not hurried, not hesitant, toward the front row. The memorial chair waited. She picked up the bouquet from where it rested against the seat. White roses, her father's favorite. She placed it gently on the empty chair, aligning the stems, smoothing one petal that had folded inward. Her fingers lingered on the frame of the photograph. A man mid-laugh, sunlight caught in his eyes. "I saw you," she whispered. Not accusation, confirmation. No one noticed when she turned away. She passed behind the catering tent, slipping off her heels as she walked. The grass was cool beneath her feet, grounding. A valet smiled at her, assuming nerves. She returned the smile. It cost her nothing. Inside the administrative tent, a clipboard lay unattended on a folding table. The marriage license rested on top, unsigned. Karen picked up the clipboard, felt the weight of the paper, the future it pretended to promise. Her name was already printed, elegant, permanent. Nicholas is beside it, waiting. She set the clipboard down, carefully. She didn't tear the paper, she didn't mark it, she didn't take it with her. She simply left it as it was. Outside the gates, a car waited. The driver opened the door without question. As the vehicle pulled away, the sound of the ocean faded, replaced by the low hum of escape. Behind her, music swelled. Guests rose. Nicholas stepped into the sun, smiling, unaware. And the chair at the front remained empty, no longer just for the dead, but for a bride who chose not to sign her life away. The ceremony began. Karen did not look back. The motel sign buzzed like a trapped insect. Karen stood beneath it in the thin blue light of early morning, the kind that makes everything look honest. Brick, asphalt, even regret. A highway ran past in a steady hush, trucks exhaling into the distance. Her rental car sat 2 spaces away, dust already settling into the seams like it belonged there. She wore a plain sweatshirt and jeans, no jewelry, no wedding ring-shaped tan line. Her hair was pulled back tight, not for style, but for speed. When she walked, she did it like someone who had decided that panic was a luxury. Inside, the room smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee. A single lamp cast a dull cone of light on a table she'd turned into a battlefield. Folders, legal pads, printed screenshots, a worn copy of a newspaper article sealed in plastic. On the bed, her phone vibrated again. Nicholas, 12 missed calls. Unknown, 3 missed calls. Mom, 1 missed call. Karen set the phone face down without reading anything further. She opened the thickest folder and let it fall flat with a sound like a verdict. Case file. Harris v. Whitmore Estate. Dismissed. 10 years ago, there had been an accident on a rural road. Headlights, rain, a sudden stop that came too late. Her father's name had been dragged through local headlines for weeks. People loved a villain with a zip code like theirs. People loved even more when the villain had money. Karen had been 19 then. She remembered the way her mother had drawn the blinds for days, as if darkness could keep shame out. She remembered her father's face when he came home from court. Tired, older, but still upright. Still her father. Now she read the documents like someone reading an autopsy of her own past. A civil suit had been filed. A grieving family had demanded answers, demanded restitution, demanded a reason the world made sense. The case had moved forward until one piece of evidence arrived and changed everything. Mechanical inspection report, brake failure documented. She reread that line 3 times, slower each time. Not a cover story, not a rumor, a documented fault, a manufacturing defect, the kind that didn't care who you were or what you deserved. The case had been dismissed, legally, quietly. No televised moment of redemption, no public apology from the people who had whispered "killer" at grocery store checkout lines. Her father had been cleared by the court, but that had never cleared him in the eyes of the town. Karen flipped to the next section, handwritten notes on yellow legal paper, her father's tight, disciplined script. Then she found it. A financial statement, thin but heavy with meaning. Whitmore Family Trust, established. Beneficiaries, the Harris family. Amount, $3,750,000. Status, unclaimed. Karen's throat tightened, not from tears, she refused to let herself have those yet, but from the sharp pressure of disbelief. She stared at the word unclaimed as if it were a typo. Her father had done this. Not because he was forced, not because a judge ordered it, because he couldn't undo what happened, and he had tried, quietly, to soften the part of the world that couldn't be softened. She leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. The lamp hummed. Outside, tires on wet pavement made a soft, continuous shh, like the road itself was keeping a secret. Nicholas's words returned, uninvited. Their family fortune will finally pay for your legs and my father's life. So he didn't know, or someone had made sure he didn't. Karen opened her laptop. The screen's glow carved sharp angles along her cheekbones. Her reflection looked older than it had a week ago. Her eyes held that new kind of focus, a woman who has stopped asking why and started asking who. She searched the trust's managing institution. The name of the family attorney appeared immediately, polished and prominent. Law Office of Gerald P. Mason, Estate Management, Trust Administration, Generational Security. Generational Security. Karen almost laughed. It came out as a single breath through her nose, humorless, sharp. She clicked deeper. Old email confirmations, archived statements, transaction histories, and then an empty gap where there shouldn't have been one. Months, years, movement that made no sense for a dormant trust. She printed everything. The motel printer whined, spitting out pages with slow reluctance. Karen watched each sheet land like another step forward. When it finished, she gathered the stack and tapped it on the table to align the edges. The movement was controlled, precise, like she was building a weapon out of paper. Her phone buzzed again. This time the screen lit up with a voicemail preview from Nicholas. No transcript, just the timestamp. Karen didn't play it. She slid the marriage license copy she'd kept, unsigned, untouched, into the folder's inner pocket. Not a souvenir, a reminder. If she'd stayed, if she'd smiled, if she'd signed, everything would have been legal, and she would have been trapped inside someone else's story. Karen zipped the folder into her bag and stood. The room swayed slightly, not from fear, but from momentum, like the world was finally moving in the direction it should have moved a decade ago. Karen flicked off the lamp. In the dark, her face was only partially visible in the window's reflection, lit by the motel sign outside, red, flickering, relentless. She whispered into the quiet, to the father who wasn't there, to the version of herself who once believed love could protect her. I'm going to find the truth. Then she opened the door and drove toward it. The law office smelled like lemon polish and old power. Karen stepped through glass doors that reflected her back at her, smaller than she felt, sharper than she looked. The lobby in East Hampton was designed to soothe. Pale stone floors, framed coastal paintings, a bowl of green apples that no one would ever eat. Behind the reception desk, a young woman in a navy blazer smiled with practiced warmth. "Ms. Whittemore?" the receptionist asked, eyes flicking to Karen's face as if matching it to headlines. Karen returned a polite nod, the kind that said, "I belong here," without ever raising her voice. "Mr. Mason is expecting you." Of course he was. Men like Gerald P. Mason were always expecting you to trust, to sign, to leave things in their hands. Karen followed the hallway toward his office. The carpet swallowed her footsteps. The walls displayed framed photographs of Mason shaking hands with men in suits, trophies for loyalty, proof of proximity. At the end, a frosted glass door read, "Gerald P. Mason, S.Q., Trustee and Counsel." Karen exhaled once, controlled, and entered. Mason rose from behind his desk with a smile that tried to be paternal. He was in his 60s, hair silver and immaculate, cufflinks gleaming like tiny shields. The office window looked out on manicured hedges, nothing messy allowed to grow here. "Karen," he said warmly, as if the last decade hadn't happened. "What a surprise. We were all concerned." "We," a careful word, a communal blanket offered before a knife. Karen replied, her voice even, "I'm sure." She didn't sit until he gestured. She didn't soften her jaw. She didn't blink too quickly. Mason folded his hands. "How can I help you?" Karen set a thin folder on the desk, not the whole case file, just enough bait. "I'm reviewing my father's trust activity, the one established for the Harris family." A flicker, so small it could have been a trick of the light, passed through Mason's eyes. His smile didn't change, but something behind it recalculated. That was long ago. Painful. Why reopen? Because it wasn't been touched, Karen cut in, not loud, just exact. And because I found irregular movement. Mason's gaze dropped to the folder. He didn't reach for it. "That's a serious accusation," he said, voice still smooth. "Trust accounts can be complex. Fees, market adjustments." Karen leaned forward slightly. The overhead light caught her cheekbones and left her eyes in shadow, a deliberate contrast. Then explain this. She slid one printed statement across the desk. Mason glanced at it. His fingers stayed clasped. For a heartbeat, the room held still, air conditioning humming, a distant phone ringing somewhere, a muted laugh from down the hall. Then Mason reached for the paper. He read it quickly, too quickly. Karen watched his mouth tighten at the corners, like he was biting down on something sour. I can look into this, but you must understand, Karen. Your father's... Don't, Karen said softly. That one word landed hard. Mason lifted his gaze. Excuse me? Don't use him as a shield, she said, her voice calm enough to make it dangerous. If something happened, it happened under your watch. The air shifted. The warmth drained out of Mason's smile like water down a sink. He set the paper down. And what exactly do you think happened? Karen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened her own notebook and flipped to a page of dates, each one underlined, each one tied to a transaction, each one leading to the same conclusion. Her pen tapped once on the paper, a metronome. I think, she said, you've been feeding Nicholas a story for 10 years. Nicholas? Mason asked, his eyes narrowing. Karen watched his reaction the way you watch a suspect react to a name they weren't expecting. His composure didn't crack, but something behind it shifted, like a door locking. I met Nicholas because of you, Karen continued, measured. You introduced him at that charity gala. You called him a good man who deserved a second chance. Mason's lips parted slightly, then closed again. Karen let the silence press on him. You told him my father bought his way out, that the money disappeared because it never existed, that the Whittemores erased what happened. Mason's expression hardened, the paternal mask slipping into something colder. You're speculating. Karen reached into her bag and withdrew a second packet, printed emails, time-stamped forwarded chains, not everything, just enough. She placed them down like cards in a game she'd already learned to win. Mason stared at the top page. His name, his words, his assurances. Karen watched the color fade slightly from his face. Behind his desk, a framed certificate caught the light, Fiduciary Excellence Award. Karen's gaze settled on it for one long moment. Then she looked back at him, her eyes steady. Tell me, Karen said quietly, how a trust meant for grieving people becomes a weapon you point at my family. Mason leaned back in his chair. A slow inhale lifted his chest. Outside the window, hedges rustled in the breeze, controlled nature, trimmed into obedience. Inside, Gerald Mason's smile returned, but now it held no warmth at all. You should be careful, he said, voice low. Some truths don't protect you, Karen. They ruin you. Karen didn't flinch. She stood, gathered her papers, and slid them back into her bag with deliberate care. Then it's a good thing, she said. I'm not here to be protected. As she turned to leave, Mason's voice followed her like a shadow. And what do you think Nicholas will do when he learns you're the reason he loses everything? Karen paused at the door. The hallway lights behind her hummed, sterile and bright. In the glass panel, her reflection stared back, still, unblinking. She didn't answer Mason. She simply walked out, already hearing Nicholas's vow echo in her mind. Not the one at the altar, but the one in that dressing room. And she realized something that made her stomach go cold. Nicholas hadn't just been lied to, he'd been aimed. The boardroom in Manhattan was all glass and altitude. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, slicing the long table into rectangles of glare and shadow. The city sprawled below like a living circuit board, orderly, relentless, indifferent. Karen stood at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly on the polished surface, fingers relaxed. She wore a charcoal suit, severe in its simplicity. No jewelry, no softness to misinterpret. Across from her, Nicholas looked like a man who hadn't slept. His tie hung loose, his jaw was unshaven, the shadow uneven, unfamiliar on a face once so carefully curated. His eyes, dark, searching, locked onto Karen the moment she entered, as if she were a mirage that might vanish if he blinked. "You disappeared," he said, voice hoarse, skipping every courtesy. "You don't get to do that and then—" "I do," Karen replied calmly, not defensive, declarative. And I did. The lawyers shifted in their seats, two on Nicholas's side, one on hers. Papers lay stacked in front of them like neutral witnesses. Nicholas laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You think this is about feelings?" He gestured around the room. "You left an unfinished marriage, a public disaster, and a company half owned by me," Karen said evenly. "Still." That stopped him. She slid a single document across the table, a quitclaim deed. The paper caught the light as it moved, its edges precise, official, irrevocable. Nicholas stared at it. "What is this?" Karen answered. "Restitution. Voluntary. Personal shares only. No corporate entanglements. No conditions." One of Nicholas's attorneys leaned in, scanning the page, brows knitting. "This transfers a significant portion of your personal holdings to Mr. Harris." Nicholas's head snapped up. "You're just giving this to me?" Karen met his gaze without flinching. "Yes." Silence pressed in. The city outside seemed to pause, traffic far below moving without sound. "Why?" Nicholas asked finally. Karen considered him, really looked at him. The man she'd once loved, now stripped of certainty, wearing anger like armor that no longer fit. "Because what you lost mattered, and because what my father carried with him all his life mattered too." Nicholas's laugh came again, but this time it cracked halfway through. "This is pity." "No," Karen said. "This is closure." She reached into her bag and withdrew another folder, thinner, lighter. "I'm not contesting your narrative. I'm stepping out of it. You wanted justice in dollars because that's what you were taught to measure. I won't argue with that." Her lawyer cleared his throat softly. "Once signed, Miss Whitmore relinquishes all claims to these shares." Karen nodded. "I understand." Nicholas's eyes flicked to the document, then back to her face. His voice lowered. "And after this?" Karen straightened, smoothing the front of her jacket. The overhead lights carved clean lines along her profile. "After this, I disappear," she said simply. "You think money fixes this?" Nicholas demanded, something raw breaking through his control. "You think this absolves?" "I don't think it fixes anything," Karen interrupted gently. "That's the point." She slid a pen across the table toward him. "This isn't forgiveness. It's me refusing to be the final chapter in your anger." Nicholas stared at the pen as if it might bite him. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, he picked it up. His signature came out jagged, uneven, nothing like the confident strokes he used to sign contracts. When he finished, he set the pen down and pushed the paper back toward her. "There," he said quietly, "you've paid." Karen watched him for a second longer, not with triumph, not with sorrow, just with recognition. Two people standing on opposite sides of the same wound. She signed her name. Clean, steady, final. The sound of the pen leaving the paper felt louder than it should have. She closed the folder and stood. Nicholas looked up at her, something unsettled in his eyes. "You're just walking away?" Karen paused at the window. The skyline reflected faintly in the glass over her shoulder. "I walked away at the altar. This is just me finishing the thought." She turned back to him, her face calm, almost kind. "I hope it gives you what you think you need." Then she left. No press, no statements, no explanations. By nightfall, the news would break. Nicholas Harris, newly installed majority holder, a dramatic takeover, a woman who vanished with her dignity intact. But as Nicholas sat alone in the boardroom, the city lights blinking on one by one, the signed deed heavy in his hands, a different weight settled in his chest. He had the money, he had the power, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't feel victorious. He felt empty. The box arrived without a return address. It sat on the front step of the small Westchester house like a guest who didn't knock. Plain cardboard, taped with care, no logo, no flourish. Nicholas's mother, Diane, spotted it through the lace curtain just after sunrise. The world outside was pale and quiet. A thin winter light spread over the lawn. She stared at the package for a long time before calling out his name. "Nicky," she said, voice carrying that old mix of authority and fragility. "There's something here." Nicholas came down the hall barefoot, hair still damp, shirt half buttoned. Since the takeover, sleep had become something he visited briefly, like a motel off the highway. He stopped when he saw the box. His face tightened immediately, suspicion sliding into place like a lock. "Don't touch it," he said. Diane's hands hovered above the take anyway, trembling. "It's not," she swallowed, "it's not heavy." Nicholas bent, inspected the seams. No strange wires, no chemical smell, just tape and cardboard and a neat strip of handwriting on the top. "For Diane Harris." His throat moved when he swallowed. He carried it inside as if it were fragile or dangerous. He couldn't decide which. They set it on the dining table. The room was filled with muted comfort, family photos, a worn runner rug, a lamp that cast a soft pool of light. In the corner, Diane's wheelchair waited like an accusation. Nicholas reached for a knife, then hesitated and used his fingers instead, peeling the tape slowly. The sound was intimate and ugly. Rip, rip, like fabric tearing. Inside was not cash, not jewelry, not legal documents. Inside was a smaller wooden chest, dark walnut, polished smooth. A brass latch gleams faintly, the kind of box you'd see on a mantel holding someone's ashes or someone's secrets. Diane inhaled sharply. "That's beautiful." Nicholas didn't answer. He lifted it out and set it down. His hands were careful despite the anger in his shoulders. A single envelope lay on top, cream paper, her name written again. Diane. For a moment, her eyes softened. Then, as if afraid softness might break her, she hardened her mouth and nodded at Nicholas. "Open it," she said, "before I lose my nerve." Nicholas slid a finger under the flap. The envelope gave way. The letter inside was handwritten. Karen's handwriting. He recognized it instantly. It was the kind of writing you didn't learn from school, but from patience. Steady, clean, deliberate. Diane began reading aloud, her voice quiet but clear. "My name is Karen Whitmore. If you're holding this, it means Nicholas has taken what he came for. I won't argue about what he believes, but I can't leave without offering you something money can't buy." Diane paused. Her fingers tightened on the page. Nicholas's jaw flexed. "Stop," he said, but the word lacked force. Diane continued. "What happened 10 years ago was an accident. It was also a tragedy. My father carried it with him every day afterward. I want you to know he didn't hide. He didn't celebrate. He didn't sleep well. He made choices that never made headlines because they were not meant to." Diane's eyes grew wet. She blinked fast, as if tears were a weakness she'd trained herself out of. Nicholas reached for the wooden chest, fingers moving as if to end this, to control something. The latch clicked open with a small metallic sound. The lid lifted. Inside were photographs, neatly stacked. Not glossy society pictures, not staged. Candid, grainy, taken from a distance. A younger Nicholas standing outside a high school, backpack slung over one shoulder. Nicholas at a grocery store, pushing a cart beside Diane's wheelchair. Nicholas at a cemetery, head bowed, hands shoved in his pockets. And in each photo, always in the background, always half hidden, Karen's father, watching from afar, not approaching, not intruding, just present. Nicholas stared, throat tightening as if something lodged there. Diane's hand flew to her mouth. A small, broken sound escaped her, more breath than sob. At the bottom of the box were more envelopes, each sealed, each addressed to Diane or Nicholas, but never sent. Diane lifted one with shaking fingers. The paper was thick, the ink slightly faded. Her voice came out thinner now. "He wrote these," she whispered. Nicholas's eyes stayed on the photographs, his pupils widening as if the room had dimmed. The lamp's soft light caught the edge of a picture, his father's grave marker in the distance, rain on granite. At the very bottom, beneath the letters, lay a final note from Karen, smaller, folded twice. "Forgiveness cannot be bought. It can only be earned through truth. I'm leaving you the only inheritance I can, proof that my father tried. I hope one day Nicholas chooses to try too." Nicholas's hands closed around the note until the paper crumpled slightly. Diane looked at her son, her face illuminated by the warm lamplight, tears finally slipping free. "Nicky," she said, voice breaking, "what have we done?" Nicholas didn't answer. He stared down at the memorial box, at the evidence of a man he'd hated without ever truly meeting. And somewhere deep inside him, something began to shift. Not toward love, not toward peace, but toward doubt. Because the story he'd lived on for 10 years suddenly had cracks. And cracks let light in. The corner office looked exactly like Victory was supposed to look. Glass walls, a panoramic sweep of Manhattan, a desk wide enough to command an army. The company logo, clean, modern, expensive, mounted on the wall behind him like a crown. But the room felt wrong. Too quiet, too bright, too empty. Nicholas stood near the window with a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He didn't drink it. He watched the city move below, tiny people with tiny urgencies, and tried to locate the feeling he'd been chasing for 10 years. Satisfaction. Closure. Something. Instead, all he could hear was the low hum of fluorescent lighting and the faint rhythmic click of a keyboard somewhere down the hall, like the building itself was keeping time. Behind him, a conference room door shut, not slammed, not dramatic, just closed. He turned. The hallway beyond the glass walls was half lit, a strip of muted carpet and polished steel. His assistant, Mariah, hovered at the threshold, her posture tight, her mouth set as if she'd rehearsed the sentence and still didn't trust it. "Mr. Harris," she said softly. Nicholas didn't correct the title anymore. He'd grown used to it. It was the one part of this that felt real. "What?" he asked, and his voice came out sharper than he intended. Mariah swallowed. Her eyes flicked briefly to the floor, then back up, an instinctive move people made around unpredictable men. "We've had more resignations." Nicholas blinked once. "How many?" She said, 4 this morning, 2 from compliance, 1 from partnerships, and she hesitated, then continued. "Mr. Lomax from finance submitted his notice at 8:12. Nicholas stared at her like she'd spoken in another language. Lomax had been with the company 23 years. Lomax had attended Nicholas's engagement party. Lomax had once called Karen the steady hand this place needed. Nicholas's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "Did they say why?" he asked. Mariah's expression didn't change, but the tension in her throat told the truth. "They're citing leadership concerns." Nicholas let out a short laugh that didn't reach his face. "Leadership concerns," he repeated, tasting the phrase like something bitter. Mariah took a half step forward, voice cautious. "There's also Not now, Nicholas said. Mariah paused, then nodded. She started to retreat, but Nicholas's voice stopped her. Mariah. She turned back. Am I a pariah? He asked, and the question surprised even him. It slipped out before pride could catch it. Mariah's lips parted, then closed again. She looked at him like she was seeing the man behind the title for the first time, and that made Nicholas's stomach twist. I think, she said carefully, people don't know who you are yet. They only know what they've heard. Nicholas's mind flashed to headlines. Hostile takeover. Jilted bride. Harris claims Whitmore fortune. The kind of story the public loved because it was simple. Good and evil, rich and wronged. He'd leaned into it. He'd let it harden him. He wore it like armor. Now it felt heavy, suffocating. Mariah left quietly, the door clicking shut behind her with the finality of a judge's gavel. Nicholas stood alone again. On his desk, the walnut memorial box sat where he'd placed it last night, as if it had followed him here. He hadn't meant to bring it to the office, but he'd woken up with it on the passenger seat of his car, like a passenger he couldn't refuse. He moved toward it, slower than he wanted to. The lid was slightly ajar. Inside, the photograph stared up at him. Past Nicholas, present Nicholas, the boy he used to be. And behind that boy always, Karen's father, a figure half in shadow, face turned toward them with a kind of grief Nicholas couldn't name. Nicholas lifted one photo and held it up against the window light. His hand trembled. Not from anger, from the uncomfortable sensation of a belief collapsing. He set the photo down and opened a drawer where he'd kept the quitclaim deed. The paper was crisp, official, his name printed in bold like a reward. He should have felt triumphant every time he saw it. Instead, he felt like he'd inherited something dirty. His phone buzzed. A text from a partner. We're terminating our contract effective immediately. We cannot risk reputational damage. Another buzz. Board wants emergency meeting. Investors uneasy. Another. Media asking if Karen will sue. The vibrations piled up like knocks at a door he didn't want to open. Nicholas sank into the leather chair behind the desk, the one Karen used to sit in when she visited the office. Calm, attentive, never wasting a word. The chairs swallowed him, too large, too soft, making him feel like a child wearing a suit. He looked around the office again. It wasn't victory. It was a museum of other people's expectations. He had taken the company. He had taken the money. He had taken the story he thought he deserved. And somehow, the emptiness inside him had only grown, widened by each resignation, each turned-back glance, each whispered hallway conversation that stopped when he walked past. Nicholas pressed his palms against his eyes, hard enough to see stars. In the dark behind his eyelids, he saw Karen at the Hamptons altar, silent, composed, leaving her bouquet on the memorial chair. No screaming, no curse, just a woman stepping out of a trap. Nicholas lowered his hands. His breathing had changed, shallower, faster, like someone cornered. He reached for the top letter in the memorial box, the one he'd avoided reading twice already. His mother's voice echoed in his mind last night, thin and trembling. What have we done? Nicholas unfolded the letter. The paper trembled between his fingers, and as he began to read, the city outside kept moving, sunlight turning the glass towers gold, while inside the office, Nicholas Harris finally understood the cruelest part of revenge. You can win everything and still lose yourself. The conference room was colder than it needed to be. Not from the air conditioning alone, but from intention. Nicholas had ordered it that way. Cold rooms kept people alert. Cold rooms made liars swallow harder. A long rectangular table sat beneath recessed lights that flattened every face into truth or something close to it. A pitcher of water stood untouched at the center, beads of condensation sliding down the glass like quiet sweat. At one end of the table, a court reporter adjusted her headset and tested her machine. Beside her, Nicholas's new general counsel, Angela Reyes, stacked binders with a precision that made Nicholas think of knives. Across from them sat Gerald P. Mason. He wore a navy suit that fit perfectly, as if he'd dressed for photographs, not consequences. His hands were folded, his posture upright, his expression composed. Only his eyes gave him away, restless, scanning for an exit that wasn't there. Nicholas took his seat without greeting. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer warmth. He opened the first binder, and the sound of the rings snapping apart cut through the room like a small, satisfying crack. "Mr. Mason," Angela said, voice professional, calm. "You understand you're under oath." Mason smiled faintly. "I do." Nicholas watched his mouth move and felt something in his chest tighten. Not rage, exactly. Rage was easy, familiar. This was something heavier, the weight of being wrong for too long. Angela slid a document forward. "Let's begin with the Whittemore Harris Trust, established 10 years ago. You were the acting trustee, correct?" Mason's gaze flicked to Nicholas for half a second, measuring, searching. "Correct." Angela nodded. "And you were obligated to act in the best interests of the beneficiaries." "Of course." Nicholas leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. The light above caught the faint shadow under his eyes, sharpening him into a man who looked as tired as he felt. "Then explain," Nicholas said, voice low, "why the trust was never received." Mason's smile held. "To my understanding, the Harris family never completed the required—" "Stop," Nicholas said. The single syllable landed like a door slamming. Angela didn't flinch. She opened to the next tab and slid out a series of bank statements. "These are transfer records, from the trust's holding account to a private entity registered in Delaware. Not the Harris family, not a charitable foundation, a private entity." Mason's eyes narrowed. "I can't speak to every transaction without reviewing—" "Then review that." Nicholas pushed another folder across the table. Mason looked down. For the first time, the polished mask slipped just slightly. His brow furrowed, his lips pressed together, his fingers, still folded, tightened until the knuckles whitened. Angela's voice remained steady. "This email is from you to Mr. Harris 8 years ago. In it, you state, quote, that the Whittemores have paid to bury the truth. You encouraged him to pursue the estate aggressively." Mason's jaw tightened. "Those were my impressions at the time." Nicholas's voice dropped lower, dangerous in its calm. "And this one?" Angela pulled a second page. "This is from 3 years ago. You write that Karen will break if pressured at the right time." The words hung in the air like smoke. Nicholas's stomach turned. He remembered Karen's face in that dressing room reflection, calm, composed, already leaving him behind. He remembered her signing the quitclaim deed without flinching. The rake. She hadn't broken. He had. Nicholas sat back, letting the chair take his weight. His voice softened, not kinder, but more final. "You stole from my family. You stole from her father's attempt to do something right, and you made me the villain so you could stay invisible." Mason's composure cracked at the edges. His eyes sharpened. "If you go forward with this, you'll destroy reputations. Yours, the company's, Karen's." Nicholas stared at him, and for the first time, the fear that had kept him obedient for years evaporated. "You already destroyed hers. Now I'm returning the favor. Only this time, it's truth." Angela slid a final document across the table, a formal notice of referral, criminal investigation request, embezzlement, and fraud. Mason's face drained of color. "Mr. Mason," Angela said clearly, "did you embezzle funds from the Whittemore Harris Trust?" Mason opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Nicholas watched him, this man who seemed untouchable, this architect of lies, and felt something unfamiliar rise through the emptiness. Not triumph, accountability. As the court reporter's keys clicked in steady rhythm, Nicholas realized this deposition wasn't just about the trust. It was about the story he'd lived inside. And for the first time in a decade, he was no longer letting someone else write it. Mason finally spoke, voice strained. "I want to speak to my attorney." Nicholas didn't smile, but his eyes did something else, something quieter, more dangerous. They didn't look away. And somewhere far from that cold room, the consequences began to move, slow at first, then gathering speed, like a storm that had finally been named. Not of the vest, though the high-visibility fabric sat stiff across his shoulders, but of the silence around his name. No one here cared who he had been. No one asked about boardrooms or buyouts. On the side of the interstate, with trucks tearing past and cold wind clawing at your ears, a man was only as useful as his hands. He stood at the edge of a highway outside Columbus, Ohio, holding a slow stop sign. Morning light spread thin and gray across the pavement, turning every puddle into a dull mirror. The air smelled of wet asphalt and diesel. A road crew foreman, a broad man in a weathered cap, barked over the noise. "Harris, eyes up. You miss a car, you'll be wearing it." Nicholas nodded once. "Yes, sir." The words still felt strange in his mouth. "Yes, sir," but he didn't spit them out. He let them sit. He let them humble him. He'd stepped down as CEO 3 months earlier. No dramatic announcement, no glossy interview. He'd walked into the boardroom, slid a resignation letter across the table, and watched men in suits scramble to understand a decision that didn't come with a profit motive. They'd called it a breakdown. They were wrong. It was a choice. Now, instead of silk ties, he wore gloves that smelled like rubber and work. Instead of private drivers, he took buses that rattled, their seats worn down by other people's fatigue. He slept in motels and cheap rentals, waking to curtains that never quite closed, to light that didn't care if you were ready. He kept moving. Montana would come later. He wasn't ready for that kind of quiet yet. In Kansas City, he spent 2 weeks with a road safety nonprofit, standing in a gymnasium under fluorescent lights while folding pamphlets about seatbelts and brake inspections. The room was filled with volunteers, retirees, teenagers needing service hours, a woman with a toddler on her hip. No one knew him. He liked it that way. One afternoon, a boy of maybe 10 approached the table. Freckles, missing front tooth. He pointed at a poster showing a crumpled car and bold safety statistics. "My dad says accidents are just bad luck," the boy said. Nicholas's throat tightened before he could stop it. He picked up a pamphlet and slid it toward the child. "Sometimes they are," he said, voice low. "And sometimes there's something that could have been prevented." The boy frowned. "Like what?" Nicholas glanced at the poster. Brake failure, distracted driving, weather conditions. Words that had once been abstract to him now felt like stones in his pockets. He said, "Like checking what needs checking and telling the truth when something breaks." The boy nodded as if that made sense, then ran off. Nicholas watched him go, feeling the strange ache of wanting to rewind time 10 years and do one thing differently. Just one. But penance wasn't about rewinding. It was about carrying. In Montana's neighboring states, he worked construction for cash, hands blistered, back sore. In a small town in Idaho, he washed dishes in a diner until midnight, steam fogging his eyelashes, plates clattering like impatient applause. The owner, a tough woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, watched him one night as he scrubbed a pan like he was trying to erase something. "You running from the law?" she asked. Nicholas kept scrubbing. "No." "Running from a woman?" she pressed, almost amused. Nicholas paused. Water ran over his knuckles. He didn't answer right away. He didn't want to turn Karen into a story he could use, even in his own head. Finally, he said, "I'm running from the person I was." The woman studied him for a long beat, then nodded once as if she'd heard that before. "Well," she said, tossing him another stack of plates, "keep running, but do the work while you're at it." And he did. He attended traffic safety meetings in church basements. He listened to parents speak about children lost, voices steady from repetition and sorrow. He stood in the back, hands clasped, the lights dim, the air thick with coffee and grief. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just stayed. On the 1-year mark of Karen's wedding day, the day he would have called his anniversary, Nicholas found himself in a quiet motel room in South Dakota. The window looked out onto a parking lot dusted with snow. A lone streetlight cast a pale circle on the ice. He opened his duffel bag and pulled out a folder he'd carried across hundreds of miles. Inside was the trust documentation, restored, audited, corrected, and beneath it, a court petition Angela helped him file, a motion to formally clear Karen's father's name. Nicholas stared at the paperwork until his eyes burned. Then he took out a pen and wrote a single sentence on a blank page. "This year is not for her to forgive me." He paused, his hand trembling slightly. He wrote the second line. "It's for me to become someone who doesn't need forgiveness to act right." Outside, a truck passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the room like a searchlight. Nicholas closed the folder and set it beside the bed, as if placing it gently would make the truth gentler. Then he lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the heater click on and off. And in the dark, he finally allowed himself one honest thought, quiet, terrifying, and clear. When he found Karen again, it couldn't be to reclaim her. It had to be to return what he'd taken, her peace, her father's name, and the part of himself he'd left behind at that unfinished altar. Montana didn't announce itself. It simply opened, miles of sky, pale and wide, pressing down softly on the earth like a hand meant to calm. The road into town was a ribbon between fields the color of old gold, fenced in places, untamed in others. Snow still clung to shaded ditches, stubborn and quiet. Nicholas drove with both hands on the wheel, knuckles not white, just steady. The rental car's heater worked in weak bursts. The radio stayed off. He wanted to arrive without noise. The town's main street held a small honesty. One diner, one hardware store, one gas station with a bell that rang when you opened the door. Trucks parked at angles, dust on their bumpers. A dog lay in front of the post office, eyes half closed, trusting the day to pass without danger. Nicholas parked across from the community library. It wasn't grand, just brick and glass, a green sign with white lettering, the kind of building that didn't beg for attention but offered shelter anyway. Through the front window he could see warm light and the slow drift of people, an older man holding a newspaper, a child chasing a scarf that trailed behind her like a banner. Nicholas sat in the car longer than necessary, fingers resting on the steering wheel. He had imagined this moment in dozens of versions. None of them felt right. He finally stepped out, the cold air biting his cheeks, crisp and clean. He crossed the street with measured pace, as if any sudden movement might ruin the fragile permission he was granting himself, to be here, but not to demand. The library door opened with a small chime. Inside, the air smelled of paper and coffee and something faintly floral, hand soap maybe. Yellow lamp light softened the corners. The quiet wasn't empty, it was lived in. He paused near the entrance, letting his eyes adjust. And then he saw her. Karen stood behind the circulation desk in a forest green cardigan, sleeves pushed to her elbows. Her hair was clipped back loosely, a few strands falling near her cheek. She wore reading glasses low on her nose as she scanned a stack of returned books. Her expression was focused, calm. No performance, no armor, just presence. A small boy handed her a library card with both hands, solemn. Karen smiled, genuine and warm, and Nicholas felt it like a bruise being pressed. She stamped the card and slid it back. "You're all set, Caleb, and I saved that book about trains you asked for." The boy's face lit up. He hugged the book to his chest and ran toward a row of shelves. Karen watched him go with the softest lift at the corners of her mouth. Careful joy. Then, as if she sensed weight in the room, her gaze lifted. Her eyes met Nicholas's. The smile disappeared, not into fear, not into anger, into stillness. Her face settled into something unreadable. Her posture remained upright, but a quiet alertness moved through her like a shift in weather. Nicholas stopped where he was. He didn't step closer. He didn't say her name. He simply held her gaze and let the silence do its work. Karen removed her glasses slowly and set them down on the desk. Her fingers didn't shake. She didn't look away. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, low enough not to disturb the room. "You found me." Nicholas swallowed. The air felt too thin. "Yes," he said, "but I'm not here to take anything." Karen's jaw narrowed slightly, not suspicious, measuring, the way she might look at a stranger who claimed to know her. Nicholas shifted his weight back, a subtle step that gave her space without making a show of it. He lifted the folder he'd carried across states, the edges worn, the corners softened by travel. He held it in both hands, like an offering. "I brought something," he said quietly. Karen didn't move. The library was so silent, Nicholas could hear the soft scratch of a pencil from a table in the back, a page turning, the faint click of the heating vent. "What is it?" Karen asked. Nicholas's voice tightened, but he kept it steady. "I brought a court order and documentation. The judge signed it last month." Karen's jaw set. "Signed what?" Nicholas opened the folder just enough to reveal the first page, the stamp, the bold text, the official weight of it. "Order of Exoneration, Whittemore." Karen's breath caught. Small, involuntary, the only crack in her composure. Nicholas didn't push the folder toward her. He didn't walk to her desk. He stayed where he was, holding it, letting her decide. "I'm not asking you to read it now, or to talk to me. I needed you to have it." Karen stared at the page as if it were a ghost. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked, slowly, controlled. Nicholas watched her face, how the muscles around her mouth tightened, how her nostrils flared slightly with the effort of staying calm. Finally, she said, "Why?" It wasn't a question about the folder. It was a question about everything. Nicholas's throat burned. He forced himself to breathe, to speak without theatrics. "Because I believed a lie, and I made it louder. I made it your life. And your father's." Karen's gaze lifted to Nicholas's. There was no softness there yet, but there was a tension, and that felt like a kind of mercy. Nicholas added, "I'm not here for forgiveness. I'm here to return what was stolen." Karen's fingers gripped the edge of the desk. She glanced around, the little boy in the train aisle, the older man folding his newspaper, the quiet life she had built brick by brick. Then she stepped out from behind the desk, not rushing, not fleeing, just moving with intention. She stopped several feet away from Nicholas, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, far enough to keep her boundary intact. She held out her hand. Nicholas placed the folder into it gently, careful not to let his fingers brush hers longer than necessary. The moment was brief, but it felt like something turning. Karen looked down at the documents, then back up. Her voice softened slightly, not into forgiveness, but into clarity. "You didn't come here to fix the past." "No," Nicholas whispered. Karen's eyes stayed on him, steady as Montana sky. "Then why are you here, Nicholas?" Nicholas opened his mouth, and for the first time since he stepped into that library, he realized he wasn't sure he deserved the answer he wanted to give. The chime above the door rang again as someone entered, bright and ordinary. Karen didn't look away from him, neither did he, and the town, quiet, indifferent, beautiful, held them both in its wide, unforgiving calm. The porch wood creaked under Karen's weight, then Nicholas's, two separate sounds, two separate hesitations. It wasn't the kind of porch you photographed for magazines. The boards were weathered, the paint peeled at the edges, the railing worn smooth where hands had rested for years. A single porch light glowed above them, warm and imperfect, drawing a small circle of gold against the vast Montana dusk. Beyond the railing, the plain stretched outward like an exhale. The sky was bruised purple near the horizon, fading into deep blue overhead. Far off, a line of mountains sat like quiet witnesses. Somewhere in the grass, a wind moved through dry stalks with a soft, steady whisper, like pages turning. Karen sat in a wooden chair with a mug of tea cradled between her hands. Nicholas sat on the steps one level below, elbows on his knees, his palms open, empty. The distance between them wasn't accidental, it was chosen, honored. A silence settled that didn't feel like punishment. It felt like room. Inside the house, a clock ticked faintly. A radiator clicked as it cooled. A dog barked once in the distance and then stopped, satisfied with the world's response. Karen looked out over the land for a long time before speaking. Her face was calm, but the lamplight caught the faint shine in her eyes, something held back, not denied. "I read it," she said at last, voice quiet. "The order, the statements, the judge's finding." Nicholas didn't lift his head immediately. He stared at the porch boards as if they might teach him how to be worthy of the moment. "And?" he asked, the words soft, almost afraid. Karen's fingers tightened around the mug. "My father is cleared," she said, officially. The last word carried weight, 10 years of whispers, sideways looks, pity disguised as politeness, the kind of stain that didn't wash out with money. Nicholas nodded once, still not meeting her gaze. He should have been, a long time ago. Karen let out a slow breath. In the porch light, it looked like a small surrender. "I thought the truth would feel louder," she admitted, like a door slamming, like everyone would suddenly realize what they took from him. Nicholas swallowed. "But it doesn't." "No," said Karen, "it just sits beside you, and you learn to live with it." Nicholas's eyes finally lifted to her face. The lamplight carved gentle shadows under his cheekbones, emphasizing the tiredness he no longer tried to hide. "I didn't come to ask for another wedding," he said quietly, "or to rewrite what happened." Karen watched him, expression unreadable but not closed. "I came because I didn't want you to carry that alone anymore. Not because you need me, because you shouldn't have had to." Karen's gaze flicked away, out toward the plains, as if the horizon offered a safer place to store emotion. "You took my life apart," she said, not accusing, naming. "Not just the wedding, the years after, the trust in my own judgment." Nicholas flinched, a small tightening around his eyes. He didn't defend himself. He didn't soften it with explanations. "I know," he said. Karen's eyes returned to him. The lamplight reflected in them like small, steady flames. "And you didn't touch me," she said suddenly, voice sharp with clarity. "When you handed me the folder, you didn't move into my space. You didn't ask me to comfort you." Nicholas's hands tightened briefly on his knees. "I didn't want to steal anything else." Karen stared at him for a long beat, as if weighing the sincerity not by words, but by restraint. Then she stood. Nicholas tensed instinctively, ready to rise, to follow, to apologize again. But she didn't go inside. She walked to the railing and leaned on it, looking out at the land like she was listening to it. "Do you know why I came here?" she asked. Nicholas shook his head once. Karen's voice softened, the edges rounding. "Because no one here knew my last name. No one here asked what my father did. They asked what books I liked, what stories I could recommend. They let me be ordinary." Nicholas's throat tightened. He looked down at his hands that had signed papers to destroy, hands that had held a stop sign by a highway, hands that had finally learned what wait felt like. "I don't want to be extraordinary anymore. I want to be correct." Karen turned from the railing, her face half lit, half shadowed. "Correct doesn't erase, it just stops the bleeding." Nicholas nodded. "Then let me be that," he said softly. "Not your husband, not your savior, not your punishment." Karen studied him, and in her eyes there was something new, not forgiveness, not love, but recognition of effort sustained over time. "You're different," she said. Nicholas exhaled, a faint, shaky breath. "I had to become someone I could live with." Karen stepped closer, but not too close. She remained within her own boundary, the space between them, still present, still respected. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair beside hers. Nicholas hesitated, then moved up one step and sat, careful, deliberate, as if the chair might vanish if he took it for granted. They sat side by side, looking out at the darkening plains. No music swelled, no vows, no cameras, just two people breathing in the same quiet, letting the night do what it did best, cover old wounds without pretending they never happened. After a while, Karen spoke again, almost to herself. "My father used to say love isn't a promise you make once, it's a behavior." Nicholas closed his eyes briefly, the words landing like something holy he didn't deserve but needed. When he opened them, he didn't look at her, he looked at the horizon. "Then I'll start there," he said. Karen didn't answer right away, but her shoulder eased, just slightly, toward his, not touching, not yet. And in that small shift, quiet as winds through grass, something real began. Not a grand wedding, a new chapter, one written slowly, by choice. This story reminds us that truth delayed can wound just as deeply as truth denied, and that real redemption never comes loudly or performatively. Healing begins not when someone demands forgiveness, but when they take responsibility without conditions, respect boundaries, and choose integrity even when no reward is guaranteed. Love, at its most honest, is not about possession or grand gestures. It's about restraint, accountability, and the courage to stop causing harm. Now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered a truth that changed how you saw someone or yourself? Have you had to walk away from something valuable to protect your peace? What does accountability look like in your own life, beyond words? If this story resonated with you, feel free to share your experience in the comments or send us your story privately, details in the description. Your voice might help someone else feel less alone.